Hi, my name is Lukáš Likavčan, and I'm leading the investigations of the politics of infrastructures research group at Centre for Audiovisual Studies at FAMU in Prague, in Czech Republic. And to introduce a bit what we're doing here, let me explain you first some motivations that lead to my interest in infrastructures, which actually they have been of a long-standing interest to my practice. Because already during finishing my degree in philosophy back in 2014, I realized, predominantly thanks to the work of some thinkers such as Bruno Latour or Peter Sloterdijk, but also thanks to some Marxist thinkers, I realized back then that the ways how we encapsulate ourselves in different networks, bubbles, and environments that we design, that usually leads to unconscious automatic change in our ways of thinking and also in our ways of behaving. So this idea of the change of behavior or thinking based on infrastructures is very old. It's actually based on the thesis of historical materialism of the Marxist thinkers that I've already mentioned, because it is the deep material layer of productive forces that in the last instance always shapes productive relations, or said differently, that infrastructure always determines superstructure. And after all, it was Louis Althusser, this brilliant 20th century French Marxist, that very precisely quoted Blaise Pascal in relation to explanation of this subjectivizing effect of infrastructures. This quotation by Pascal concerns not natural but religious beliefs, and it goes like this. Kneel down on your knees, move your lips in prayer, and you'll believe. And explains, it gorgeously explains what actually is going on when we're talking about something like infrastructural change, or the change of the social setting based on infrastructures. And to explain this a bit more, there's actually an alternative genealogy to this word of infrastructures that comes from the history of translations of Hegelian thinking all the way to Michel Foucault. So, as was noted by a very sad hero of the recent pandemic intellectual hot takes, Giorgio Agamben, it is Hegel who, in his philosophy of religion, distinguished between natural and positive religion. Hegel literally said that while natural religion is concerned with this immediate and general relation of human with the divine, while positive or historical religion encompasses the set of beliefs, rules, and rights that in a certain historical moment are externally imposed on individuals. So this positivity in the concept of positive religion denotes for Hegel, according to Agamben, those historical elements that condition philosophical thinking in a given epoch. So these historical elements are, in other words, set of beliefs, institutions, processes of subjectivation, and of rules in which power relations become concrete. According to Agamben, then, the idea of positivity is translated into the work of Michel Foucault as the notion of dispositive, which is translated to English as apparatus, which is also a term frequently used by Agamben, who defines apparatuses as anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. And I don't agree with that definition, and I'll explain in the moment why that definition is problematic. But before I do so, just a bit of anecdote, because based on these remarks, we can see what one of my colleagues also expressed when he said that, French social theory, starting with Foucault and going all the way to Latour, it can be actually read basically as a historical materialism, just with a very different notion of history and with a very different notion of materiality. However, now the problem arises because this genealogy that I've just presented you can be easily contested as leading to some misleading or actually very misleading claims about infrastructures. So first, this idea of apparatus or dispositive doesn't in any meaningful way distinguish between institutions and infrastructures. And so it doesn't differentiate diverging qualities of institutional and infrastructural power. And I guess that's actually the point why we do infrastructural analysis, because we want to clearly distinguish the institutional from the underlying infrastructural background, which seems to be the terrain on which, institutions grow as mushrooms, if you will. And so that's the first obstacle. And the second objection comes from the observation made in a bit different context by Karen Barat, because she claims that apparatuses are not just preconditions of subjectivation, but also preconditions of objectivation. Her example is that just as a particle in quantum physics, which, with all its specific qualities, arises only in the aftermath of the measuring act, a measuring act done by a measuring apparatus, so the given ontological regime of agency, which is related to subjectivity, and ontological regime of non-agency related to objectivity, emerges only in the specific infrastructural context that diagrams and furthermore imposes the lines of agency that are accordingly distributed in the population of entities. So it is not enough to simply say that infrastructures are apparatuses. It's a trap. It would be more correct to say that apparatuses become infrastructures as a result of the process of their crystallization and of their sedimentation in a sort of cosmic background of our social and political worlds. And that leads me to the point of my brief introduction, which is a claim that regimes of objectivity and regimes of subjectivity are, somehow infrastructurally determined. But not only that, it is also regimes of spatiality and temporality that are also just aftermaths of a specific infrastructural setting. And, our research at Politics of Infrastructures led to uncovering different notions of space in the last year. So the three researchers of the Politics of Infrastructures research group from the academic year 2019-2020, that is Anežka Horová, Daniel Burda, and František Fekete. So these three researchers directed the attention to the essential infrastructure of global capitalism, which is logistics and supply chain. And we have together visited on a field research or doing field trips, we have visited warehouses of the local Czech #1 online store called Alza, which is best known for its annoying public relations campaigns based on an image of a little green man. And just before the pandemics hit us, we have managed to visit the port of Rotterdam, Maasvlakte 2, which is the largest container terminal on our continent and also the most advanced semi-automated logistical landscape to the date. Our interest was in demarcating at once coexisting and conflicting notions of space that are implicitly performed by the Rotterdam port infrastructure. These three regimes of space are the zone, the grid, and the planet. The brief research snippets by Anežka, by Dan, and by František, all these three research videos shine a light on the workings of this almost human exclusion zone of the world. And they also present a collection of very useful afterthoughts for further mediations on the topic of logistical modernity. Because to follow Benjamin Bratton's introduction to English translation of Paul Virilio's Speed and Politics, it is in this extra-legal logistical archipelagos where the administration of bare life takes place and where logistic remains, at least for this moment, not necessarily, but at least for this moment, a continuation of the war by other means, a continuation of this kind of extractivist assault on our planet which is best exemplified by the proximity of the Royal Dutch Shell Company, which is one of the largest oil refineries in the world, to the port of Rotterdam. Still, after all we have seen and all we have learned, we believe and hope that another logistical regime is possible. One that would be perhaps based differently on the notions of space performed by the infrastructure of the port, one that perhaps can lead to some evacuation plan from the deadlock of modernity.
The port in Rotterdam spans from the city border to the westernmost part of the artificial port of Maasvlakte, situated 40 kilometers from the city. The locations are connected by a channel. There are docks, cranes and pumped storage water reservoirs lining along the whole length of the channel. And the most important part of the port is Maasvlakte, a tip of an artificially created landmass protruding into the ocean. In the middle of Maasvlakte, there is an enclosed space where the most effective part of the whole process takes place: the fully automated transfer and handling of containers. Maasvlakte is the type of space we call the zone, following by the theorist Keller Easterling. Zone of a free trade, a zone of international trade, a special economic zone, an export processing zone, which is a dynamic crossroads of trade, finances, administration, and communication. If there are various spatial types that illustrate how the architecture has become repeatable and infrastructural, then it is the zone that shows how the urbanism has become infrastructure. The Rotterdam port is an example of such a zone. It is an industrial park with restricted access that serves to protect people from harm and prevent the disruption of the smooth operation of some of the machines, as their behavior could pose unforeseeable consequences. The same restrictions then apply to all visitors of the port as the expansion of zone that intrudes deeper into the real environment inscribes itself deeper into the consciousness of people as an imperative of an accessibility of the space.
Okay, so I'm going to present my part of the text, which is called Grid. The visitors of Maasvlakte port are led along the predefined path, being allowed to explore only surfaces, as they can neither enter the control centers nor look into the internal principles that guide the coordination of ships, cranes and goods. The visitors is led along the edge by the fences that separate her from the movement and dynamics, while their immediate purpose stays obscure to her. It is because what we only ever see is just one segment of a process. We see containers, but not what they hold. We see ships, but not the place of their departure. And we see people too, but their exact role within the whole organization stays hidden. The great volumes of ships, containers, goods, and people thus become flat in the eyes of the visitors. Listing the circulation of goods in tons is but an abstract number. Our view of the port is limited since we don't see it from within, but from the edges of demarcated zones. The core of the port builds around itself a wall of security. We cannot enter, and our imagination thus stands at the edge of the precipice. And while the port seems indifferent, it nevertheless communicates with us. One way to meet this communication halfway can mean tuning into these objects, tuning into the joint grid. Besides, meeting this infrastructural grid, one cannot avoid certain fascination. This feeling accompanies the appearance of things whose complexity transcends human imagination. It is radical otherness that shapes us without being comprehensively understood. Sightseeing the port while passing by immense ships with thousands of containers, one can glimpse a moving orange spot that suddenly transforms into an employee of Costco Shipping Company. It is only the reflective color of his safety vest that makes him visible in the midst of thousands of tons of standardized blocks. The containers that surround him are the extracted pieces of the planet ruled and occupied by his species. The person in an orange uniform is also one of the knots in the grid, who is constantly mapping the reality around her and thus recreates it. The logistical infrastructure which she is part of is is determining her existence, but she herself creates it as well. And interconnections and a variability of single knots and their pulse in time is very similar to a system of neurons in a human brain. They are also pulsing in specific frequencies and constantly creating new constellations of relations, thus reacting to the impulses. The space of logistical infrastructures is thus not a thing, nor is it a phenomena. It is a virtuality itself. We can define virtuality as an immaterial thing having material impacts. The infrastructure as a whole is just abstract, immaterial grid imagined in our heads. Nevertheless, when we are looking at the worker at the ship, he is one of the material knots of the grid. Single things are thus not being enclosed to themselves, but opening themselves to the grid of calculated interactions with other ones. This relational complexity and pulsing effectivity of accumulation is something exceeding us, but defining us in the same time as well. The Rotterdam port is one of the knots, opening itself into another millions of knots. One of the knots are also us, human beings. We are the part of the hyper-object, which negates and transcends the possibility of its perception as a whole. We are the part of the grid, which we cannot perceive.
The notion of the planet that we are walking on is really old. The old questions of whether the planet is plane or sphere, commanded and protected on one side by the theological point of view, on the other side was the point of view of the modern science. From that point on, we haven't moved really much further. We still only try to glimpse what the real effects and inner processes of the planet really are. But we still seem to only think about the planet as a passive mass, which is not really undergoing any intelligent processes, any, what would I call, a signaling of the intelligence. And this signaling comes from the notion that we are not the only intelligent creatures that are present in the space surrounding us. The famous novel of Stanislav Lem, Solaris, presents a famous story of astronauts that land on a planet that really is something different to what the standard planetary model suggests. It's a living planet, but it's a living planet only occupied by one large mass of ocean. And the ocean is actually emitting some thoughts and projections that realize in front of the astronaut. We are in a way in a very similar situation because we are projecting some thoughts on the planet and the planet is sending back some data. When one is present in Masflakte, he or she is surrounded by scalingly massively different objects, and in that very situation, which is abnormal, one can really start to glimpse the details and the differences, and his or her thought might, for a moment, start to be emitted or signaled in a different manner. And this different manner, this what I called a performative thinking in a different mode, is the very mode that we should be looking for when trying to habitate the planet in a more peaceful and environmentally friendly way.